Welcome guys to another part of our C++ tutorials for beginners. So in this tutorial, we're going to cover two aspects of C++, which is going to be the while loop and the for loop. So when to use the while loop is very important. It helps you to code more efficiently. When you know how many times you want to loop through your block of code, you can use the for loop. While the while loop comes in handy when you don't know how many times you are going to loop through your code. So first of all, let's look at the while loop. Now for the while loop, I want to loop through a number until it is lesser than 5, for instance. So I'm going to say int declaring a variable, we'll call it number, num for short, is equals to, let's assign it at 0 for the first initiation. Now I'm going to use the while loop. So it works like this. I'll say while, which is the keyword, then we pass in the condition number is less than or equals to, let's use 5. I want to loop from 0 to 5. So you're going to use 4. Let me just switch this to 5. I want this to loop from 0 to 5. I'll start from 1 instead. So I want this to loop from 1 to 5. Then I will pass in the condition that will be run when the code is still under or equals to 5. So I would use cout, which is used to print to the console, and I pass in what I want to print out to the console. As the case may be, I will just say num, and I'll use this. Then I'll pass in the number. Or let me just clear this up and just pass in only the number. For this sake, we pass in the number. Then I want to print on a new line every time I run a new code. N. Then I close my line of code here. Then I would, now I have been able to declare my number to be of 1 integer. Now the code here tells me what should happen before this code is executed. Now once this code is executed, I must always increment. To increment, I just have to pass in the num variable and I add the plus plus. So whenever this code runs, it's going to come back and increment to make sure that my code does not run forever. It's going to increment by 1. That's why I have the plus plus. It's going to increment by 1 every time this code runs until this number is less than or equals to 5. So let's run this in the console. Close this. Let's run this in the console and see the end result. Let's comment the end the line of code there. Now when I run this in the console, I should be seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It stops at 5 because 5 at this point is not is less than or equals to 5. When it comes again and increments it, it turns to 6. So 6 is not less than or equals to 5. Let me take that again. How this works is that at the first initiation, and a number is 1. Okay, so you use that 1 here, it comes here and it becomes 1. Now when it uses, take that, it becomes 1. Now when it checks to see if 1 is less than or equals to 5, it prints out the action because it is true. Then it increments it by 1 again, then it turns to 2. It checks to see if 2 is less than or equals to 5. If the condition is met, which is true, it turns to 3. It goes like that until it gets to 5. Then it checks to see if 5 is less than or equals to 5, which is true. 5 is less than, it's not less than 5, but it's equals to 5. So it checks to see if it's true, then it runs again, and it stops when number is equals to 6, because at this point now number is not lesser than 6, not lesser than 5, nor is it equals to 5. So it's going to end the condition at 5. Okay, so that's the concept of the while loop. So now if you see in our terminal, we have 1 all the way to 5. We don't get 6 because 6 is not less than 5. I can put 6 in there by just changing the end result, the limits to 6. So when I run this in the console, you would see that it has been effected and it reaches 6. That's just the logic of while loop. Now we have the for loop, which allows us to loop through a bunch of code for a limited number of time. Now we know how long we want to run our code, so we can use the for loop. So how does the for loop work? The for loop works in this manner. I'm going to give you the syntax first of all. Now for the for loop, you do not declare your variable outside, you declare a variable inside, like so. So for the first initiation, I am going to say, now I want to use an integer. Let's call the integer I and assign a value to the integer. Let's say 1. Now this is the first expression. I want to declare a variable and assign a value to that variable, which is 1. Now for the second initiation, I'm going to pass in what condition I want to test for. I want to say if I is less than or equals to 5. This is the condition I want to test for. I end it again with a semicolon. Now, with for loops, we do not increment at the end of the code. We increment in this bracket braces here. So we are going to increment here and say I. What is it? I will say I is equals to, let's just make it I, still saying I plus 1. I plus 1 is still the same thing as saying I plus plus. Okay, so I can still say I plus plus, or I can say I plus 1. Let's just use I plus plus. Still the same thing. So now I want to run my block of code. Now I'm going to pass in the block of code in the curly braces here, curly brackets here. Now I want to say cout less than sign, pass in my I that I want to print out to the console, then print it on the new line, /n to print on the new line. Then I end my line of code here. Now when I run this code, my code should increment 5 times, then print the results to the console. Okay, so let's run this again. Now when I run this, I get like expected 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so we can use the for loop to loop through a series of code, as well as using the while loop. The only difference is that for the for loop gives you a limit. You have an idea of how many times you want to run already, as compared to the while loop. That's when you should know that's the main differences of these loops. When you know how many times you want to loop through, it's always advisable to use the for loop. Okay, we can even have a loop nested inside another loop. How would that work? Okay, so this is how to increment with for loops in C++, or we could still use, for loops we could still use the plus plus sign I here. It still works in the same way to increment by 1. Let's nest a for loop in another for loop, having a nested for loop. We can do that by just simply, let me just copy this because I'm lazy. Let's copy this out, then let's run this code in here again and say another for loop is going to happen here. Then we close this up here. Then let us print something here. We say cout. Let's drop some text before we print out. Let's say inner, so we know that okay, this is the inner line of code. Then let's drop in let's call this variable j, do some cleaning up afterwards. Then we say front/n, then we end the line of code there. So for that, we can't have the two variables as the same name, so we're going to change that to j, and we're incrementing with j. Now I would use this one as I, but I'll add some text here and call this inner, and close this here, and I think that should solve the okay, that should solve it. So now I'm just nesting a for loop in another for loop. I want to show you how it works. So I want this to run 2 times, but I want this to run 6 times. So now look at the logic here. Now what's going to happen is that this block of code, first of all, will run. Now this for loop is embedded in this outer for loop. So what happens is that when the first time this one runs, it's going to execute this one 3 times before it comes in to run again, which is making the second iteration. Then it will come around this one again 3 times. So making this one execute 6 times. That's your inner for loop to execute 6 times. Sorry, let's change this to outer. Your inner for loop to execute 6 times, and your outer for loop to execute 2 times. So this is how you can go about having nested for loops. If you want a condition to iterate once every if you want a condition inside to iterate a couple of times, when the outer condition has executed once, you can use the for loop, the nested for loop, to achieve that goal. So when I run my code here, you can see that I'm having my code multiple times, my inner code multiple times before my outer code. Now see, I have the outer code here once, then I have the inner code 1, 2, 3. I have the outer code again once. I have the inner code 1, 2, 3. So in that way, I've been able to run this inner code 6 times and the outer code 2 times. That's the concept of nested loops. You can use it to just bunch in a couple of loops and have different iterations for when the outer iteration runs successfully. So this is just the concept of loops in C++. You have seen the for loop, you have seen the while loop and you have seen when best to use both of them. You can also use the for loop to loop through arrays. You can use the for loop to loop through arrays in such a way that it's going to run through each and every array until the array is exhausted without you having to increment anything. Let me give you guys an example. But in our next class, we're going to be talking about arrays. I'm going to be looping through arrays. So if you don't understand the concept already, I will be talking about arrays in much more details in our next tutorial. But I want to just give you an extra content for this class. So I can say int, I call it my number, and I would pass in the space of this array, which is going to be 5. Now to declare an array, we use the curly braces, and I can say my array will be 10, 20, sorry, 20, 30, 40, then 50, as the case may be. This is just my IDE intelligently allocating these numbers to their index positions, which is from 0 to 5. Arrays begin at 0. So now I have declared my array. Now I want to loop through my array, and I'm going to do that like so. I will clear this up, and now to loop through this array, I will just simply clear this up and declare only this int here. And when I declare the int, I'm going to use this int I've declared to pass my array, so my number. That is how it's going to run. So I'm going to just simply say my number is going to be what you are going to test for, and it's going to be the limits. Automatically the limit is going to be 5 then. So this is how you can use a for loop to loop through an array. Let's just clear this up here. Clear this up. No need for this content anymore. Then let's loop and see what we're going to have. Now when I run this to the console, I should be seeing that I'm having an error here. Okay, I closed in my, let's drop that back. I closed in the return statement there. Okay, I think that's fixed. So when I run this to the console, I should be able to have looped through the array on my list. Okay, as you can see, I have 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. So this is how we can also use the for loop to loop through arrays. For loops are very, very powerful in programming. So you need to understand how to use the for loops to loop through a bunch of arrays and numbers, as the case may be. So I have been able to loop through the arrays here. Now, arrays is just a container for storing like data. I'll be talking about that in my next tutorial. This was just an extra content for you to learn in this tutorial. Yeah, so I have showed you guys how to use the for loops, how to loop through arrays, how to use the while loop, and why not to use both loops. So that's it for this tutorial. In my next tutorial, I'll be talking much about arrays, the concept of arrays, and how we can manipulate arrays, change number in arrays, allocate arrays to allocate different values in arrays, remove, pop, delete, manipulate arrays, and a whole lot more. See you guys in the next tutorial. Cheers.